All right, next up we've got Heiko Schneck. Hello.
Hello.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Heiko Schneck. I live in a small village close to Stuttgart in Germany. I'm a CG artist, designer, working on all kinds of projects. And I'm in the industry for 12 years. And I'm working with Houdini full-time with for like 4 years now.
Right on. So what are you going to be talking about today?
I'm talking about my entry for the Mardini challenge. The theme for this day was grass, and I created a small meadow with some flowers growing and building up towards the side effects logo.
Excellent. Well, let's check it out.
Hello. So I was taking part in Side Effects Mardini challenge. Sadly, I couldn't finish all 31 entries because of other projects getting in the way, but Side Effects asked me to give a quick overview of one of my winning entries, and I'm very happy to do so. The theme for day 13 was nature grass, and I created a short animation of a summery meadow with a lot of grass, for sure, and a few growing flowers which reveal the Houdini logo in the end. I'll show you my setup to build a very simple but effective and flexible grass scatter. I quickly go over the setup I used for instancing the animated flowers, and to wrap things up, I quickly run over my material, light and comp setup. So let's dive in. If you're looking at grass, you'll see that it's not growing as single blades, it's growing in tufts or clusters of grass. So I started out by creating a default setup for my first grass tuft. So there's a cluster of grass blades. It's just a single grid with a few bends and a mountain sub to distort it a little bit. I create UVs for the material later on. And I also added colors because I only use one material for all the vegetation. So I grab all the colors from the geometry. Down here I have my loop, my for loop, which creates the copies of the grass. And for every copy it randomizes a few parameters. For example, the bend value and also the translation, rotation and the scale. For all these parameters I want to randomize, I use the same random expression. I'm using the iteration number of the for loop as a basic seed, and then I multiplying or scaling the value accordingly. So down here I created a color adjustment node to randomize the color of the grass blades, and I copied the exact same expression and just multiplied it by 0.1. One last important thing to note is every time you copy this expression, you should add some random number to the seed, so you get different random numbers for every parameter. And this is the basic setup for the grass tuft. I just copied the whole setup and added a few nodes inside here and a few additional band stops to make this bent down grass, which serves as a ground cover. And then I duplicated the setup again and created this tall grass, which is mainly for breaking up the silhouette of the whole meadow a little bit. All of these clusters get a name attribute to later on get selected by the copy sub. On a scatter sub, I use my ground, I scatter some points. I intentionally disabled the relax iterations to get not this super uniform distribution. I use attribute randomize subs to randomize orientation and p-scale. On the p-scale attribute most of the time I use this custom ramp where I vary the size of 95% a little bit, and then I have a few ones really sticking out. And lastly, I add a string attribute to the points, also with a name. name. This controls in the copy sub which piece from the left side is copied to which point on the right side. From here you can easily dial in your proportional distribution of your different grass types, or even add more plants and grass variations to this setup. One last thing for Redshift is you have to check this instance sub-level pack primitives, otherwise Redshift doesn't use its own instancing system and is converting the whole meadow to one big geometry with millions of polygons. So let's quickly take a look at the flowers. For the flower, I really created a very simple procedural flower model, which is looking like this. It really consists only of a few petals that I copied around to form the blossom, and the whole blossom is copied to the end of this banded line. I created a quick animation, which is looking like this, and then I wrote this to disk. On the scatter side, I again imported the ground. And here I mapped the Houdini logo from an image into the density attribute, which drives the scatter density here. On this side, I'm animating this sphere and converting it to a volume, smoothing it a little bit to increase the fall off a little bit. And on this point wrangle, I use a volume sample to write the grow attribute on the points, which later drives the grow animation of the instances. Then again, I randomize orientation and scale, and from there I have my instance points. Then I struggled a little bit because I wanted to create the animated instances with a copy sub and a for loop. In the past, I mostly used the normal instance workflow and just assembled instance path, instance file path attributes with some point wrangles and read the single frames from disk. But this setup is quite error prone and it's not very flexible because you have to save everything on disk. So this time I wanted to use the default Houdini nodes and the copy sub. And the first thing that came to mind is just to go through all the points and for every point select the right frame. But it was very slow because it has to handle all the pieces individually. On my original scene, I just used a static flower and the p-scale attribute to interactively adjust and preview the timing of the animation. And then I just used the slow instances for rendering. But while recording this video, I came up with another setup that really worked very well. So here I'm using the same animated flower and just looping over the animated frames and creating or preparing 25 packed pieces with their respective frame number. And then on the right side, I create a frame attribute to select the right frames in the copy sub. And from here you get some nice growing flower instances, which preview interactively, which you can use for rendering, and aside from a few viewport glitches, work really well. So finally, let's take a quick look at the materials. So the ground is barely visible, so it's just a dark brown default shader. And for the grass and the flowers, I use the same material. It's looking like this. I grabbed the geometry color and then use two noises to vary the brightness and the saturation across the whole meadow. Another important part of shading leaves or blades of grass and petals is translucency or backlighting. For this I just used a more saturated and darker version of the base color. Down here I have a bump map. This is what the UVs are for on the grass blades. And this creates these streaks. This is stretched, very stretched noise. And it just breaks up the highlights a little bit and gives some additional detail. So for the light, I just used the default Redshift daylight system. It was the most flexible option to exactly position the sun and adjust the width and the haziness and color. The camera animation is a very simple camera rig which basically rotates around the Houdini logo, which is revealed in the end. So it's just these two nulls which are animated. And finally I rendered the 120 frames. It took about 1 hour to render on my two 1080 Ti. When the render was finished, I did a quick comp using the Redshift PostFX node. I added some bloom, some vignetting and a slight color correction. From there, I just ran my Mardini top. It kicks off the comp render and creates an MP4 video file and a GIF file ready to post on the Mardini forum. As you can see, all these setups are quite basic, but for me this was inherent to a daily challenge, and maybe it even was one of the reasons to take part. To create quick and interactive setups that focus on exploring only one or two aspects, while always creating some finished piece in the end. In this scene it was about scattering and finding new alternatives for all my old instancing workflows, especially when rendering with Redshift or Arnold. It was a great experience. I met new people, tried new stuff and learned many new things. So thanks to all the people at Side Effects to make this happen, and thank you for taking the time. And I hope you can take away a few bits and pieces from this. If you have any further questions or just want to say hi, I'm happy if you just drop me an email, or you can just find me on YouTube and Instagram by my name. So thanks, goodbye, and tschüss.